Muse should become a Sedevacantist. The historical record destroys the seamless continuity middle position. I am going to talk about Vatican II, religious coercion, Florence, historical victims of heresy prosecution, and the progressive versus Sedevacantist fork. Core thesis: Vatican II made major substantive departures from the dominant preconciliar Catholic tradition. Progressive Catholics call that correction. Sedevacantists call it apostasy. The nothing important changed position is the least honest account of the evidence. Opening: Ethan, your own method points towards Sedevacantism. Ethan, this argument is not that burning heretics was good, that the confessional state was good, or that Sedevacantism is morally attractive. The argument is narrower and harder. Given your own public posture toward tradition, saints, historical criticism, and eternal hell, Sedevacantism is more internally consistent than ordinary post-Vatican II Catholicism. At roughly 43 minutes into the Capturing Catholicism interview about your conversion, the auto-generated transcript records you dismissing modern historical scholarship as people willing to go through the New Testament with a scalpel and create a fan fiction. That is not a small complaint. It is an accusation that mainstream historical method mutilates the evidence whenever it conflicts with inherited ecclesial witness. You cannot use that posture selectively. You cannot appeal to historical testimony when it supports papal authority, miracles, saints, or institutional continuity, and then call trained historians fan fiction writers when they document large changes inside Catholicism. The same historical method that studies the New Testament also studies councils, papal legislation, inquisitorial procedure, political theology, slavery, anti-Judaism, religious liberty, and the actual fate of dissenters. The historical question is not obscure. Did Vatican II preserve the dominant Catholic political, juridical, and pastoral order with only minor changes? Or did it replace major parts of that order with a different model? The evidence overwhelmingly supports the second answer. The honest fork is this: either the old coercive and exclusivist tradition was authoritative and Vatican II betrayed it, or the old tradition contained grave moral and institutional error and Vatican II began correcting it. Progressive Catholics take the second route, Sedevacantists take the first. Conservative continuity apologetics tries to avoid the fork by reducing reversals to development, coercive doctrine to discipline, institutional persecution to the secular arm, and categorical condemnations to meanings that became visible only after the Church stopped enforcing them. That is not a neutral reading of the record, it is a rescue operation. 1. The argument in plain form. The historical premise. For most of Catholic conciliar and institutional history, the Church did not present itself as a voluntary association whose task was limited to persuasion. It claimed authority to define orthodoxy, condemn error, punish baptized dissenters, regulate public worship, enlist civil rulers, censor books, and protect the social supremacy of Catholic truth. These were not occasional accidents sitting outside the tradition. Councils, popes, canonists, inquisitors, theologians, saints, bishops, and Catholic rulers repeatedly treated them as legitimate parts of Christian order. The Vatican II premise. Vatican II changed the governing presumption. It affirmed a civil right to religious liberty grounded in human dignity. It treated separated Christian communities as instruments the Spirit could use for salvation. It repudiated the presentation of Jews as rejected or accursed by God. It explicitly allowed that people outside explicit knowledge of Christ and the Church could attain salvation under specified conditions. It replaced the characteristic conciliar language of anathema and coercive enforcement with dialogue, conscience, partnership, invitation, and service. The normative fork. If the earlier tradition was morally and doctrinally protected from grave error, the post-conciliar settlement is a betrayal. If the post-conciliar settlement is morally superior, then Catholic tradition was capable of sustaining grave error for centuries and required correction from historical experience, moral criticism, and voices it previously marginalized. Why the middle collapses. The middle says both that the old order was genuinely Catholic and that the new order is genuinely Catholic, while insisting that no major reversal occurred. That can be maintained only by changing the level of description every time the evidence becomes uncomfortable. When the old church restricts worship, the apologist calls it a contingent policy. When Vatican II declares religious freedom a right grounded in dignity, the apologist calls it the same eternal principle under a new application. When councils demand coercion, the apologist points to the executioner. When Vatican II condemns coercion, the apologist credits the Church. The institution receives full authorship for the humane development and minimal responsibility for the brutality it authorized. If old Catholic strictness is your evidence of authenticity, then follow it to its institutional conclusion. Do not use Vatican II as a shelter from the tradition you praise. 2. Your fan fiction charge creates a problem for you. You argue that modern historical critical scholars can reconstruct a Jesus who bears little resemblance to the enduring witness of the early church. Your complaint is that later scholars arrive with tools, cut apart the sources, and fabricate an alternative history. The problem is that modern Catholic continuity apologetics often does exactly that to Catholic history. It takes a medieval council that orders rulers to suppress heretics, a saint who explicitly defends lethal punishment for heresy, a council that categorically assigns outsiders to everlasting fire, and an institutional record of trials and executions. Then it dissects every item until the visible pattern disappears. Exterminate becomes merely political removal. Put to death becomes a personal opinion with no bearing on tradition. Everlasting fire becomes an implicit statement about culpable rejection whose qualifications are absent from the decree itself. The handing over of condemned heretics becomes proof that the Church did not execute anyone. That method does not preserve the historical witness. It neutralizes it. It produces a carefully engineered Catholicism in which the old institution never really endorsed what it repeatedly legislated, defended, and practiced, and the new institution never really rejected what it plainly ceased to teach and enforce. A serious historian does not begin by assuming that the institution cannot substantially change. A serious historian asks what authorities said, what legal structures they built, what actions followed, what opponents understood them to mean, and how later teaching altered the presumption. Once that method is applied consistently, major discontinuity is not a hostile invention. It is the obvious description. 3. The old conciliar norm was juridical, condemnatory, and coercive. John W. O'Malley was not a Sedevacantist. He was a Jesuit priest and one of the most important modern historians of Trent, Vatican I and Vatican II. His value here is precisely that he welcomed Vatican II while describing the old conciliar norm without pretending it was already Vatican II in disguise. The literary genre the Council adopted and the vocabulary inherent in the genre were different from that of all previous councils. John W. O'Malley. Vatican II. Did anything happen? 1. O'Malley explains that the dominant forms of earlier councils were legislative and judicial. They defined, commanded, condemned, anathematized, deposed, and attached penalties. He states that coercive enforcement by emperors, kings, and other lay rulers remained a constitutive element of councils down to Vatican I. That sentence alone destroys the claim that coercion was merely an unfortunate secular intrusion unrelated to the conciliar system. Coercive enforcement by emperors, kings, and other lay magnates continued to be a constitutive element of councils down to Vatican I. John W. O'Malley. This matters because Vatican I was not the historical anomaly. Vatican I still belonged to the old juridical world. Vatican II was the anomaly. No condemnatory canons, no attached anathemas, no program for rulers to suppress named errors, and a deliberate adoption of a new pastoral genre. The form or genre results in a council different from every one that preceded it. John W. O'Malley. 1. O'Malley's comparative conclusion is blunt. Vatican II did not merely soften the tone of an unchanged structure. It taught through a different model of ecclesiastical conduct. The change in style was a change in what the Church was telling itself to become. Lateran IV, coercion written into an ecumenical council. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 was one of the most important medieval councils. It enacted major reforms, defined doctrine, regulated clerical life, legislated concerning Jews and Muslims, promoted crusading, and established a system for suppressing heresy. Canon 3 did not merely advise princes to maintain public peace, it required them to act against persons identified by the Church. Secular authorities shall be compelled by ecclesiastical censure to exterminate all heretics pointed out by the Church. Fourth Lateran Council, Canon 3:2. The Latin and the precise force of exterminate have generated discussion. In medieval legal usage, it could encompass expulsion or removal, rather than mechanically meaning execution in every case. That does not rescue the continuity claim. The canon still commands rulers under ecclesiastical pressure to purge their territories of people identified as heretics. It threatens rulers who refuse. It deprives heretics of legal security and embeds coercion inside conciliar law. The system divided labor. The Church determined heresy, imposed spiritual and legal penalties, degraded clergy, and delivered obstinate offenders to civil authority. Civil officials carried out corporal sentences. That institutional division does not make the Church a spectator. A prosecutor does not become uninvolved because a prison officer locks the cell. Augustine, from persuasion alone to defended coercion. Augustine is frequently presented as a saint of grace, interiority, and pastoral depth. He was also foundational for the Latin Christian defense of coercing religious dissenters. In Letter 93, discussing the Donatist conflict, Augustine openly records that he changed his position. Originally, my opinion was that no one should be coerced into the unity of Christ, but I have yielded to the evidence. Augustine, Letter 93:3. The Donatist conflict was not a simple story of harmless saints on one side and harmless dissenters on the other. Some circumcellion groups committed violence. The relevant point is different. Augustine did not defend coercion only as ordinary policing of assault. He defended laws pressuring religious return to Catholic unity because he came to believe coercion could rescue people from error. The coercion itself acquired a pastoral justification. That logic endured. Force could be medicinal, punishment could be charity, and protecting souls could justify restricting outward religious action. Vatican II's language of immunity from coercion is not the normal continuation of that logic. It changes the moral presumption. Aquinas, lethal punishment defended as justice. Thomas Aquinas did not hide behind euphemism. In the Summa Theologiae, he compared heretics who corrupt faith to counterfeiters who corrupt money. Since counterfeiters could be put to death, he argued that obstinate heretics could be treated even more severely. Heretics deserve not only to be separated from the Church by excommunication, but also to be severed from the world by death. Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologiae, 2:2, question 11, article 3, 4. Aquinas then describes the ecclesiastical sequence: correction, excommunication, and delivery to the secular tribunal for death if the offender remains obstinate. This is not a rumor about medieval cruelty. It is the explicit reasoning of a canonized doctor of the Church whose theology became central to Catholic formation. A traditionalist can say Aquinas was correct. A progressive Catholic can say Aquinas was gravely wrong. What cannot survive the quotation is the claim that lethal coercion against peaceful doctrinal dissent was alien to serious Catholic tradition. 4. Florence, the old exclusivist settlement in its strongest conciliar form. The Council of Florence matters because it was not a local inquisitorial manual or an angry sermon. It was an ecumenical council recognized by the Catholic Church. In the decree commonly called Cantate Domino, issued for union with the Copts in 1442, it stated the salvation boundary in categorical terms. All those who are outside the Catholic Church cannot share in eternal life and will go into the everlasting fire. Council of Florence, Cantate Domino, 5. The decree expressly names pagans, Jews, heretics, and schismatics. It continues by saying that almsgiving and even shedding blood in the name of Christ do not save someone who fails to remain within the Church's unity. This is not the emotional atmosphere of Lumen Gentium. It is not the ecumenical logic of Unitatis Redintegratio. It is not the post-Holocaust language of Nostra Aetate. Later Catholic theology developed distinctions involving invincible ignorance, implicit desire, culpability, and grace. Those distinctions matter to later doctrinal construction. They do not erase the historical force of Florence. The decree's public message was that visible separation from Catholic unity placed pagans, Jews, heretics, and schismatics on the road to everlasting fire, and that even extraordinary Christian sacrifice did not overcome that boundary. The continuity apologist answers by reading all later qualifications backward into Florence. The Sedevacantist reads Florence in its ordinary severity and accuses Vatican II of dilution. The progressive Catholic admits that the older formulation was morally and theologically inadequate and embraces correction. The latter two positions at least acknowledge what the decree sounds like and what social order it supported. Florence did not sound like Vatican II because it did not inhabit Vatican II's moral world. 5. People were killed for religious dissent without being violent criminals. The phrase, "the Church never killed anyone," depends on institutional wordplay. Ecclesiastical tribunals identified heresy, extracted recantations, imposed penances, condemned the obstinate, and handed them to rulers who supplied the fire, rope, blade, or prison. The victim was not being punished for an independent civil offense. The heresy judgment generated the fatal process. The following cases are not presented as if every condemned person was doctrinally modern, personally flawless, or politically harmless in every conceivable sense. The narrower claim is documented. These people were not executed because they murdered, assaulted, or led an army. Their fatal offense was teaching, writing, preaching, or refusing to retract religious ideas. Marguerite Porete, burned for a mystical book, Paris, 1310. Marguerite Porete was a learned Beguine mystic and the author of The Mirror of Simple Souls. Ecclesiastical authorities condemned her book. She continued to circulate it, refused to take the required oath, and would not recant. An inquisitorial process declared her a relapsed heretic, and she was burned in Paris on June 1, 1310. Sean L. Field's major scholarly reconstruction of the trial is the standard modern study. A Journal of Ecclesiastical History review calls it the most important detailed work on the case. Porete was not sentenced for stabbing anyone, burning a village, or organizing rebellion. She was killed because of a book and her refusal to submit her interior theology to an inquisitorial command. Her case alone is enough to refute the fantasy that coercive machinery existed only for violent sectarians. Jan Hus, condemned by an ecumenical council, Constance, 1415. Jan Hus was a Bohemian preacher, theologian, and university rector who attacked clerical corruption and defended positions associated with John Wycliffe. He came to the Council of Constance under imperial safe conduct, was imprisoned, tried, condemned for heresy, degraded from the clergy, and handed to secular authority. He was burned on July 6, 1415. Hus was not executed for murder. His refusal to recant doctrinal propositions drove the sentence. O'Malley himself uses Constance and Hus as an example of the judicial behavior of earlier councils. A council that restored institutional unity also participated directly in the destruction of a dissenter. Pomponio Algerio, a student executed for Lutheran beliefs, Rome, 1556. Pomponio Algerio was a civil law student at the University of Padua. The Roman Inquisition prosecuted him for Lutheran views. He refused to conform. Venetian reluctance to execute him did not end the case. Papal authorities secured his transfer to Rome. He was executed in 1556. Paul F. Grendler's award-winning History of Renaissance Universities discusses the episode in the context of intellectual life and repression. Again, the offense was intellectual and religious. Algerio was not a terrorist. He was a young student who defended propositions the Church classified as heresy and refused the demanded recantation. Giordano Bruno, imprisoned by the Roman Inquisition and burned 1600. Giordano Bruno should not be reduced to the cartoon scientist killed for heliocentrism. His case involved theology, anti-Trinitarian positions, sacramental denial, cosmology, philosophy, and magic. That complexity does not make the execution less religious. The Roman Inquisition held him for years, condemned him as an obstinate heretic, and he was burned in Rome in 1600. Ingrid D. Rowland's major biography is appropriately titled Giordano Bruno, Philosopher/Heretic. Bruno's heterodoxy was radical. It was not a violent crime. The institutional response to his words and beliefs was death. Minocchio, a miller executed after inquisitorial trials, 1599. Domenico Scandella, called Minocchio, was a Friulian miller whose strange cosmology and egalitarian religious opinions survive in Roman Inquisition records. Carlo Ginzburg's The Cheese and the Worms became one of the most influential works of modern microhistory by reconstructing his intellectual world. Minocchio was tried, warned, released, spoke again, tried again, and sentenced to death. Minocchio did not command an army. He talked, he read books, mixed ideas together, challenged ecclesiastical authority, and refused permanent silence. The Inquisition converted speech into a capital religious offense. What these cases prove? These examples do not prove that every heretic was peaceful. They prove the proposition traditionalist apologetics frequently evades. Peaceful or non-violent religious dissent could itself be treated as deserving death. The theory was defended by Aquinas. The machinery was established by councils and canon law. The Church supplied the decisive religious judgment. The state supplied the final physical act. That division of labor is historically important. It is not moral exoneration. If a religious tribunal determines that a person's speech merits removal from the world and formally triggers the state's lethal machinery, the tribunal cannot honestly present itself as unrelated to the killing. 6. Vatican II changed the presumption, not merely the vocabulary. Dignitatis humanae, from tolerating error to recognizing a right. Dignitatis humanae declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. It defines that freedom as immunity from coercion by individuals, social groups, and human authority within due limits. It grounds the right in the dignity of the person, not in the truth of the person's religion. All men are to be immune from coercion, in such wise that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs. Vatican II, Dignitatis Humanae II. 6. That is a different default from the old confessional order. Earlier teaching asked when rulers should tolerate public religious error. Vatican II asks when government may restrict a presumptive right. Gerald D. McCarthy states the point directly in his peer-reviewed analysis of Dignitatis Humanae. Such arguments overlook the sea change between the two positions. Gerald D. McCarthy, Dramatic Developments and Epistemological Crises. 7. McCarthy identifies the reversal in default rules. Under the traditional model, non-Catholic public worship was presumptively prohibitable, though prudence could recommend toleration. Under Vatican II, public religious exercise is presumptively protected, though public order can justify restriction. Calling both rules prudential applications does not eliminate the reversal. It describes how the reversal was legally organized. Unitatis redintegratio, separated communities as means of salvation. The decree on ecumenism does not merely say individual Protestants might be excused for ignorance. It assigns positive ecclesial significance to separated churches and communities. The Spirit of Christ has not refrained from using them as means of salvation. Vatican II, Unitatis redintegratio 3. 8. That sentence does not sound like a council commanding rulers to purge heretics. It does not sound like Florence's warning that heretics and schismatics outside unity go to everlasting fire. The theological system may be constructed to preserve the unique fullness of Catholicism, but the relation to outsiders has been transformed from legal suppression and damnatory warning to imperfect communion and salvific instrumentality. Nostra Aetate, the Jewish people after centuries of anti-Jewish teaching. Nostra Aetate rejects the presentation of Jews as collectively guilty for the death of Christ and states the Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God. Vatican II, Nostra Aetate 4:9. John Connolly's landmark study is titled From Enemy to Brother, The Revolution in Catholic Teaching on the Jews, 1933 to 1965. Revolution is not Sedevacantist propaganda inserted into his title. It is a mainstream historian's description of the transformation culminating in the Council. The old anti-Jewish tradition was not simply Nazi racism in a cassock. It included theological claims about collective guilt, blindness, rejection, punishment, and providential humiliation. Vatican II did not invent compassion ex nihilo, but it decisively reorganized official Catholic speech after the catastrophe of European anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. Lumen Gentium, salvation outside explicit Christian and Catholic knowledge. Those also can attain to salvation who through no fault of their own do not know the gospel of Christ or his Church. Vatican II, Lumen Gentium 16:10. The sentence is qualified by sincerity, grace, conscience, and the effort to do God's will. It is not universalism. It is still a major difference in emphasis and public doctrine from the categorical rhetoric of Florence. Florence names outsiders and everlasting fire. Lumen Gentium names outsiders and possible salvation. A theologian can build a system connecting them through culpability and implicit desire. A historian must still report the change in default message. 7. The historians do not describe a minor adjustment. The core historical case does not depend on one progressive Jesuit. Catholic, Protestant, secular, and non-Catholic historians use different methods and judgments, but their descriptions converge. Vatican II and the 20th century Catholic transformation were large, contested, and structurally important. John W. O'Malley, S.J., Major Conciliar Historian. Interpreters must also take due account of how the Council is discontinuous with previous practices, teachings, and traditions. John W. O'Malley. O'Malley names content changes involving ecumenism, biblical restriction, and religious liberty. He says those changes were opposed precisely because they were changes and calls them immensely significant. He then describes the Council's aggregate transformation in one of the clearest passages in modern Council history. From commands to invitations, from threats to persuasion, from coercion to conscience, from exclusion to inclusion. John W. O'Malley. This is a significant model shift. This is a teaching of the Council. John W. O'Malley. He goes further. The rejection of the old preparatory style was not aesthetic. It was a rejection of a whole mental and emotional framework, expressed in ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. O'Malley welcomed the result. A Sedevacantist condemns it. Both understand that it was not a minor copy edit. Giuseppe Alberigo, Joseph Comonchak, and Massimo Fagioli. Giuseppe Alberigo directed the international 5-volume History of Vatican II. Joseph A. Comonchak edited the English edition. Massimo Fagioli, a historian of the Council, describes the project as an attempt to historicize rather than memorialize Vatican II. He reports Alberigo's premise that an epochal change in Catholicism was the cause and purpose of the Council. Vatican II is much more than the sum of its decisions. Massimo Fagioli, summarizing Alberigo's hermeneutical criterion, 11. The salvation of souls, and not the conservation of the old ways, the ultimate goal of theology. Massimo Fagioli on the Council's pastoral criterion, 11. That is the progressive position stated without embarrassment. Old forms were not sacred merely because they were old. The Council could revise them to serve a different moral and pastoral mission. Sedevacantists reject that freedom. The middle tries to claim the revision happened without substantive rupture. James Chappell, secular historian of modern Europe. James Chappell's Catholic Modern explains how European Catholic political thought was remade under the pressure of totalitarianism and the crises of the 20th century. Duke University and Harvard University Press summarize the book's central historical trajectory in direct reversal language. In 1900, the Catholic Church stood staunchly against human rights, religious freedom, and the secular state. Yet by the 1960s, those positions were reversed. Publisher summary of James Chappell, Catholic Modern, 12. That sentence is a publisher's summary, not a concealed quotation from the body of Chappell's book. The attribution must remain exact. Its importance is the thesis it summarizes. Catholicism became modern by rethinking positions it had previously opposed, not by simply discovering that Pius IX had always meant dignitatis humanae. Udi Greenberg, secular historian in the American Historical Review. Udi Greenberg's peer-reviewed article in the American Historical Review calls the post-war end of prolonged Catholic-Protestant animosity one of Europe's most dramatic ideological transformations. He traces how political upheaval from the 1930s through the 1960s led Christian elites to develop new conceptions of pluralism and religious liberty. One of post-war Europe's most dramatic ideological transformations. Udi Greenberg, article abstract, 13. His explanation is historical, not apologetic. Ecumenism and pluralism emerged through Nazism, anti-communism, decolonization, missionary politics, and changing state structures. Whatever moral judgment one makes, the transformation was constructed under new conditions. It was not the ordinary Catholic political order continuing untouched. John Connolly, secular historian of Catholic teaching on Jews. The Revolution in Catholic Teaching on the Jews, 1933 to 1965. Subtitle of John Connolly, From Enemy to Brother, 14. Connolly identifies a revolution because the Council's Jewish teaching required Catholic thinkers to overturn inherited structures that had depicted Jews as rejected, cursed, blind, guilty, or providentially humiliated. A progressive Catholic can say the revolution recovered the gospel. A Sedevacantist can say it abandoned tradition. The word revolution remains historically revealing whichever moral verdict follows. Melissa J. Wild, historical sociologist. Melissa J. Wild's Vatican. 2. A sociological analysis of religious change asks why different episcopal coalitions supported or opposed reform. The Princeton description calls the result a revolutionary transformation of the Church, and sociologist Christian Smith characterizes her subject as huge institutional religious change. These are publisher and reviewer formulations, not sentences falsely attributed to Wild. Her scholarship supplies the detailed mechanism. National histories, colonial relations, institutional blocks, and organized voting produced competing Catholic futures. If the Council simply restated an obvious and universally recognized tradition, there would be no need to explain why bishops formed coalitions to defeat prepared schemers and redirect the institution. The conflict exists because the possible outcomes were materially different. Gerald D. McCarthy, The Epistemic Problem of Dramatic Development. McCarthy's article is titled Dramatic Developments and Epistemological Crises. It applies the category directly to dignitatis humanae and its contested relation to traditional Catholic thought. He does not pretend that relabeling a reversal as development makes the credibility problem disappear. His key analytical point is the change in default position. The old tradition began with prohibition and allowed toleration. Vatican II begins with a right and allows restriction. Sea change is exactly the correct expression. Norman Tanner and Sylvia Scatena, Councils and Religious Liberty. Norman Tanner's Decrees of the Ecumenical Councils remains a standard scholarly edition for the texts of councils including Lateran IV, Constance, Florence, Trent, Vatican I and Vatican II. His comparative histories make the old judicial and condemnatory pattern impossible to hide. Sylvia Scatena's La Fatica della Libertà reconstructs the laborious, contested drafting of Dignitatis Humanae. The title itself, The Struggle of Freedom, captures the point. Equal religious liberty was not simply lying on the surface of the prior magisterium waiting to be copied. Mainstream Cambridge reference works. The most important event in the history of the Catholic Church since the Council of Trent. The Cambridge History of Religions in America on Vatican II. 15. The same Cambridge summary says Vatican II reconceptualized the understanding of the Church and had a significant transformative effect on Catholic life and relations with other Christians, religions, and the secular world. The Cambridge Companion to Vatican II describes Dignitatis Humanae as effecting a sea change in official Catholic attitudes. This is mainstream academic language. Reconceptualization, transformation, revolution, reversal, dramatic development, sea change, significant model shift, and epochal change. The minor adjustment narrative is not the sober center. It is an apologetic strategy imposed on the center. 8. The Slavery Test, Chris J. Kellerman and the Collapse of Revisionist Innocence. Christopher J. Kellerman, S.J., is not an anti-Catholic historian trying to score points. He is a Jesuit priest who wrote All Oppression Shall Cease, a history of slavery, abolitionism, and the Catholic Church. The book documents Catholic teaching, slaveholding, ecclesiastical complicity, abolitionist resistance, and the long conflict between inherited accommodation and later condemnation. Kellerman describes beginning with familiar apologetic hypotheses. American Catholic slaveholders were disobedient exceptions. The Church always opposed the slavery that matters. Teaching never really changed. Then he dug into the record. Every hypothesis that I had was overturned. The truth ended up being much worse than I feared. Christopher J. Kellerman, S.J., Interview on All Oppression Shall Cease, 16. That statement should become a rule for Catholic history. When the documents overturn the comforting hypothesis, discard the hypothesis. Do not mutilate the documents until the institution regains innocence. Slavery is relevant because it exposes the same continuity technique. When older Catholic authorities tolerated, regulated, owned, or defended forms of slavery, apologists narrow the meaning of slavery, isolate papal condemnations of specific slave trades, and declare an unbroken abolitionist essence. When later Catholic teaching condemns slavery as an offense against human dignity, they call it the same teaching becoming clearer. The historical record is messier and morally worse. Kellerman's work supports the progressive conclusion: the Church can inherit, rationalize, and participate in oppression, and faithfulness can require confession and repudiation rather than fictitious continuity. A strict indefectibility theory cannot accept that conclusion easily. That is why the same evidence pushes a traditionalist toward institutional rejection, while pushing a progressive toward reform. 9. Charles Curran and the Candid Progressive Catholic Option. Charles E. Curran is a moral theologian rather than a historian. He matters because he represents the candid alternative to Sedevacantism. Curran does not solve moral change by pretending that every authoritative position was always correct. He defends the possibility of legitimate dissent from non-infallible teaching and argues that Catholic moral theology develops through history, experience, reason, and the participation of the whole Church. Georgetown University Press describes Curran's loyal dissent as the memoir of a priest who disagreed with official teaching on contraception, homosexuality, divorce, abortion, moral norms, and the role of the hierarchical teaching office while remaining committed to Catholic reform. The book includes a chapter titled The Development of Theology in the Past 50 Years. A review summarizes Curran's own stated trajectory as maturing from an uncritical pre-Vatican II Catholic into a loyal dissenter. That is the progressive path without the continuity theater. The Church can be wrong outside a restricted core. Moral theology can learn, authority can overreach. Dissent can serve the Church rather than automatically constituting betrayal. Curran's relevant works include Loyal Dissent, The Catholic Moral Tradition Today, Catholic Moral Theology in the United States, History and Contemporary Issues, Studies in Moral Theology, and Catholic Social Teaching, 1891 to present. The point is not that Curran is correct on every issue. The point is that his framework openly permits what the historical evidence requires: real correction rather than verbal reconciliation at any cost. The progressive Catholic says the Church changed because it needed moral correction. The Sedevacantist says a true Church could not make that correction because the old teaching was protected. The middle says the correction happened, but nothing was corrected. 10. The standard continuity defenses fail. Defense 1. Doctrine remained, only discipline changed. Religious coercion was not merely an administrative timetable, it was defended through propositions about truth, error, baptismal obligation, the common good, the authority of rulers, the rights of the Church, and the spiritual danger of heresy. Aquinas did not say execution was an arbitrary local custom. He gave a moral argument. Augustine did not describe pressure as neutral policing. He defended coercion as religious correction. Lateran IV did not merely regulate paperwork. It commanded rulers to act against people identified as heretics. A discipline repeated for centuries, justified by theology, legislated by councils, and treated as protection of faith, cannot be dismissed as if it carried no doctrinal content. Vatican II changed the moral anthropology and political theology governing the discipline. Defense 2. The Church did not execute, the state did. This is legally descriptive and morally evasive. Ecclesiastical institutions investigated, interrogated, judged, condemned, degraded, and handed over. The civil authority executed because the religious system classified obstinate heresy as a public offense deserving corporal punishment. The handoff was part of the system, not an interruption of it. Aquinas explicitly describes the handoff. Lateran IV pressures rulers to enforce the Church's identification of heretics. Constance condemned Hus before his execution. The claim that the Church never killed is as informative as saying a judge never imprisoned anyone because guards controlled the doors. Defense 3. Only dangerous heretics were punished. Parete's book was the danger. Menocchio's speech was the danger. Algerio's Lutheranism was the danger. Bruno's heterodoxy was the danger. The system classified religious ideas as threats to souls and social order. Once that premise is accepted, peaceful speech can become a form of public harm. That is exactly the premise modern religious liberty rejects. Defense 4. Florence addressed culpable outsiders, not the invincibly ignorant. That qualification is a later systematic reading. Florence's decree itself names categories: pagans, Jews, heretics, schismatics, and announces everlasting fire unless they join before death. It does not pause to offer the pastoral anthropology of Lumen Gentium 16. The later distinction may reconcile propositions inside a theological system. It does not make the historical rhetoric, audience, or presumption identical. The question is not whether a clever theologian can create a logically consistent set containing both documents. Given enough auxiliary distinctions, many tensions can be formalized away. The question is whether the institution's public teaching, moral emphasis, and relation to outsiders changed substantially. It did. Defense 5. Vatican II was pastoral and therefore changed no doctrine. O'Malley directly destroys this escape. The pastoral genre was itself a teaching on how the Church should act. He calls the aggregate change a significant model shift. He says the Council rejected a whole mental and emotional framework. Pastoral does not mean empty. It means that doctrine was communicated through a new ecclesial posture. Conscience rather than coercion, invitation rather than command, inclusion rather than exclusion. Defense 6. Development is not contradiction. Correct as an abstract statement. It proves nothing in a particular case. Development can preserve a principle while changing its implications. It can also become a label placed over reversal. The evidentiary task is to identify what the earlier rule allowed, what the later rule forbids, what reasons each gives, and whether the default changes. On religious liberty, the default changes. On ecumenism, separated communities change from objects of suppression to means of salvation. On Jewish teaching, inherited rejection language is repudiated. On salvation outside explicit Catholic membership, the public emphasis changes from categorical warning to qualified possibility. The change may be judged legitimate. It cannot be reduced to a minor verbal development. Defense 7. Abuses are not the tradition. An abuse is an action contrary to the institution's own law and principle. When councils legislate coercion, theologians justify it, saints defend it, tribunals implement it, rulers are pressured to assist, and the pattern persists across centuries. Abuse is not an adequate category. There were abuses inside the coercive system. The system itself also had authoritative support. Defense 8. The Church always taught human dignity. Older defenders of coercion also believed in human dignity. They believed dignity included an obligation to truth, and that authorities could restrain error for the salvation of persons and society. Merely finding the word dignity in older sources does not produce Vatican II's right to immunity from coercion. The decisive question is what dignity was made to entail. Vatican II gave it a political and juridical consequence the confessional tradition often denied. 11. Why this matters for your strict theology of hell. Your defense of eternal conscious torment intensifies the problem. You have argued publicly that offenses against God can merit unending punishment and appealed to strict saints as evidence against modern moral revulsion. You have also publicly defended a highly restrictive infernalist picture of salvation. That posture treats older severity as epistemically weighty. Saints accepted it, the tradition repeated it, and modern compassion should distrust itself. Apply the same rule to church and state. The saints and doctors did not merely believe in hell. Augustine defended coercion. Aquinas defended executing obstinate heretics. Florence issued a categorical no salvation outside the church warning. Lateran IV organized suppression. If their severity is evidence when it supports infernalism, it cannot suddenly become irrelevant historical packaging when it supports integralism and coercion. Vatican II moved toward compassion, not only in tone but in moral structure. It protected conscience, widened the visible horizon of salvation, honored separated Christians, repudiated anti-Jewish teaching, and abandoned the old council's coercive posture. If you distrust modern compassion because strict saints endorsed hell, then you have supplied a reason to distrust Vatican II for rejecting their political theology. This is why the Sedevacantist reads your instincts more consistently than the ordinary conservative Catholic. The Sedevacantist says the old severity was not embarrassing background noise. It was Catholic truth embodied in saints, councils, and popes. Therefore, a church that reverses it has defected. The progressive says the old severity proves that the church needed moral conversion. The conservative middle praises old severity in soteriology and denies its authority in politics, while declaring the whole arrangement continuous. 12. The binary conclusion. The binary is not a claim that only two sociological groups exist. There are many intermediate Catholic positions. It is a claim about explanatory honesty once the historical magnitude is admitted. Option 1. Become a Sedevacantist. Take the old councils, popes, doctors, and saints at their ordinary historical force. Treat coercive confessionalism, strict ecclesial exclusivism, and the lethal punishment of obstinate heresy as authoritative expressions of Catholic order. Treat Vatican II's religious liberty, ecumenism, Jewish teaching, and pastoral model as incompatible with that order. Then conclude that the post-conciliar claimants could not exercise the protected authority they claimed. That conclusion requires theological premises historians cannot prove: indefectibility, limits on development, conditions for manifest heresy, and loss of office. But if you already accept those strict premises, the historical evidence gives the Sedevacantist argument real bite. O'Malley supplies the discontinuity, Chappell supplies the reversal, Greenberg supplies the ideological transformation, Connolly supplies the revolution, McCarthy supplies the sea change. Florence, Lateran IV, Augustine, and Aquinas supply the older norm. Option 2. Become a progressive or left-wing Catholic. Admit that the Church's inherited tradition contained grave moral error. Admit that institutional Christianity sometimes treated oppression as order and cruelty as medicinal charity. Admit that historical experience, human rights, victims' testimony, moral reasoning, and dissenters helped the Church see what dominant authorities failed to see. Admit that Vatican II was good precisely where it broke with the old arrangement. That route resembles Kellerman's refusal to preserve innocence against the slavery record and Curran's defense of loyal dissent. It does not require pretending that every old teaching secretly meant its later opposite. It requires a more limited account of ecclesial protection and a more honest account of institutional repentance. What you cannot honestly keep. You cannot keep treating modern historians as fan fiction writers whenever they uncover a church you do not want. You cannot use saints' severity to defend eternal hell while treating the same saints' severity on coercion as disposable context. You cannot invoke Florence as proof of hard Catholic identity and then present Lumen Gentium as if it simply repeated Florence's ordinary message. You cannot praise Vatican II's compassion while denying that it corrected the tradition that made the correction necessary. Ethan, if the old harshness is authoritative, become a Sedevacantist. If Vatican II's compassion is right, admit that Catholicism needed a major correction and follow the progressive logic. Stop pretending that the correction was seamless continuity. 13. Closing statement. The historical record does not show a timelessly gentle church interrupted by a few cruel politicians. It shows an institution that repeatedly defined religious error as a public danger, legislated coercion, enlisted rulers, and punished non-violent dissent. It also shows a 20th century council that deliberately chose another model. John O'Malley calls it a significant model shift. James Chappell's thesis is summarized as a reversal. Udi Greenberg calls the wider ecumenical change one of post-war Europe's most dramatic ideological transformations. John Connolly calls the Jewish transformation a revolution. Gerald McCarthy says continuity arguments overlook a sea change. The Cambridge histories speak of reconceptualization and transformative effect. Giuseppe Alberigo's historical project begins from epochal change. These scholars do not become Sedevacantists because they do not share the Sedevacantist theology of indefectibility. Most regard the transformation as legitimate, necessary, or morally good. That does not weaken the Sedevacantist historical premise, it strengthens it. Progressive historians and radical traditionalists often agree about the scale of the change. They disagree about whether the change was liberation or apostasy. That is the argument you must answer, not by calling history fan fiction, not by separating every execution from the tribunal that caused it, not by reading modern qualifications backward into medieval decrees, not by reducing a model shift to tone. Choose the old order and follow it to Sedevacantism, or choose the humane correction and admit the Church was wrong. The historical middle has run out of places to hide. Source dossier and quotation notes. The following entries distinguish direct quotations from publisher summaries, book subtitles, and scholarly descriptions. This distinction prevents misquotation while keeping the script usable for on-screen citations. John W. O'Malley, S.J., Vatican II, Did Anything Happen? Theological Studies, 67, 2006, 3-33. Direct quotations on discontinuity, prior councils, content changes, new genre, and the significant model shift. 2. Fourth Lateran Council, Canon 3, English text in the Internet Medieval Sourcebook. Compare Norman P. Tanner, editor, Decrees of the Ecumenical Councils, Volume 1. 3. Augustine, Letter 93 to Vincentius. Direct statement of Augustine's change from persuasion alone to acceptance of coercion in the Donatist controversy. 4. Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologiae 2:2. Question 11, Article 3. Direct defense of executing obstinate heretics after ecclesiastical judgment and delivery to secular authority. 5. Council of Florence, Cantate Domino. Decree for the Copts/Jacobites. promulgated February 4, 1442. Text in Tanner, Decrees of the Ecumenical Councils, Volume 1. Online transcription linked here. 6 Second Vatican Council, Dignitatis Humanae, Official Vatican English text, especially sections 2, 9 and 12. 7. Gerald D. McCarthy, Dramatic Developments and Epistemological Crises. Horizons 43, Number 1, 2016, 1-34. Applies dramatic development to Dignitatis Humanae, identifies the reversal in default presumptions and the sea change. 8 Second Vatican Council, Unitatis Redintegratio. Official Vatican English text, Section 3 on separated churches and communities as means of salvation. 9 Second Vatican Council, Nostra Aetate. Official Vatican English text, Section 4 on Jews and rejection of the rejected or accursed presentation. 10 Second Vatican Council, Lumen Gentium. Official Vatican English text, Section 16 on possible salvation for those without culpable knowledge of the Gospel or Church. 11 Massimo Fagioli. Vatican II, The History and the Narratives. Theological Studies 73, 2012, 749-67. Discusses Alberigo, Comonchak, Epical Change, Vatican II as Event, and the Non-Conservation of Old Ways. 12. James Chappell, Catholic Modern, The Challenge of Totalitarianism and the Remaking of the Church. Harvard University Press, 2018. The reversal sentence used in the script is the publisher/Duke's summary of the book's thesis, not a falsely attributed body text quotation. 13. Udi Greenberg, Catholics, Protestants, and the Violent Birth of European Religious Pluralism. American Historical Review, 124, Number 2, 2019, 511-538. The most dramatic ideological transformations wording comes from the abstract. 14. John Connolly, From Enemy to Brother, The Revolution in Catholic Teaching on the Jews, 1933-1965. Harvard University Press, 2012. The Revolution is the book's subtitle. 15. The Second Vatican Council, Cambridge History of Religions in America. Mainstream reference summary, most important Catholic event since Trent, reconceptualization and transformative effect. 16. Christopher J. Kellerman, S.J., All Oppression Shall Cease. Orbis Books, 2022, quotation from Black Catholic Messenger interview, December 4, 2022. 17. Charles E. Curran, Loyal Dissent, Memoir of a Catholic Theologian. Georgetown University Press, 2006. Publisher description of Curran's dissent, progressive Catholic reform, and development of theology. 18. Sean L. Field, The Beguine, the Angel, and the Inquisitor. University of Notre Dame Press, 2012. Detailed scholarly reconstruction of Marguerite Porret's trial and execution. 19. Thomas A. Fudge, Studies of Jan Hus and the Council of Constance. See, Why was Jan Hus burned at the stake during the Council of Constance? Andrews University Seminary Studies, 55, 2017. 20. Paul F. Grendler, The Universities of the Italian Renaissance, Johns Hopkins University Press, 2004. Context for Pomponio Algerio and University Repression. 21. Ingrid D. Rowland, Giordano Bruno, Philosopher/Heretic. University of Chicago Press, 2009. Major Modern Biography. 22. Carlo Ginzburg, The Cheese and the Worms, Johns Hopkins University Press edition. Microhistory of Monocchio's Beliefs, Inquisitorial Trials, and Death Sentence. 23. Melissa J. Wild, Vatican II, A Sociological Analysis of Religious Change. Princeton University Press, 2007. The Revolutionary Transformation and Huge Institutional Religious Change descriptions are publisher/reviewer language. 24. Silvia Scatena, La Fatica della Libertà, Il Mulino, 2003. Major Historical Study of the Drafting of Dignitatis Humanae. 25. Norman P. Tanner, Editor, Decrees of the Ecumenical Councils. Georgetown University Press, 1990. Standard Scholarly English/Latin edition for council texts. 26. Capturing Catholicism. Why Ethan Muse converted to Catholicism. YouTube interview. The scalpel and fan fiction language is taken from the auto-generated transcript visible around 4323 to 4336. Additional works by Charles E. Curran worth citing. The Catholic Moral Tradition Today. A Synthesis. Georgetown University Press, 1999. Catholic Moral Theology in the United States. A History, Georgetown University Press, 2008. History and Contemporary Issues. Studies in Moral Theology. Continuum, 1996. Catholic Social Teaching, 1891 to present. A Historical, Theological, and Ethical Analysis. Georgetown University Press, 2002. A Call to Fidelity, on the Moral Theology of Charles E. Curran. Georgetown University Press, 2002.